It's funny how a single sentence can change everything. How a few carelessly chosen words can burn away decades of memories, leaving nothing but the cold, hard truth of the present moment. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday over lukewarm coffee in my quiet, sun-drenched kitchen. My daughter Chloe was a whirlwind of energy, as always. She had breezed in with a gust of expensive perfume and the clatter of a designer handbag hitting my humble kitchen table. She was all sleek lines and modern ambition, a living embodiment of the startup culture she so desperately wanted to conquer. I, on the other hand, was just mom. A widow in a comfortable but modest home, living a quiet life on what she believed was a fixed income and a small nest egg I'd guarded fiercely since her father passed. She had a presentation ready, of course. A glossy deck on her tablet filled with charts that went up and to the right, and buzzwords that sounded impressive but meant very little to me. Words like synergy, disruption, and show scalability. She spoke with a practiced, breathless passion about her new venture, an online boutique for ethically sourced artisanal home goods. It was, she assured me, a can't-miss opportunity, the one that would finally make her a household name. I listened patiently, nodding in all the right places, asking simple questions that made her roll her eyes just a little, as if explaining basic finance to a child. I'd always played the part, well, the simple, slightly out-of-touch mother who didn't quite understand the fast-paced modern world. It was a role I had cultivated for years, for reasons she could never begin to comprehend. The pitch ended as I knew it would with the ask. She needed capital, a final injection of funds to secure a larger inventory and launch a massive marketing campaign. She'd exhausted all her other options, she admitted, with a hint of frustration, blaming tight-fisted investors who didn't get her vision. Then she looked at me, her eyes softening in a way that was both practiced and, I suspect, a little genuine in its desperation. She spoke about my life savings, the $50,000 I had mentioned to her over the years, the money her father and I had supposedly scraped together for our retirement. It was my security, my safety net. And she wanted it. "Mom," she'd said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, "it's a smart investment. I'll pay you back double in a year, I promise. This is for our future." I looked out the window at the rose bushes her father had planted, their blossoms nodding in the gentle breeze. I thought about the lie I had lived for so long, the purpose behind it. I had wanted her to be hungry, to learn the value of a dollar earned through her own effort. I had wanted her to build something for herself, not on a foundation of inheritance, but on the bedrock of her own character. It seemed I had failed. But a part of me, a small hopeful part, wondered if maybe this was the test she just needed to pass. Maybe with a real win under her belt, she would find the confidence she was so clearly lacking, the validation she chased in all the wrong ways. So I agreed. I made a show of wringing my hands, of expressing my nervousness about giving up my entire nest egg. I went to my old desktop computer, logged into the specific checking account I maintained for this very illusion, and initiated the transfer, $50,000. It left my account with a quiet digital whoosh. For her, it was a lifeline. For me, it was less than the quarterly dividend from a single one of my holdings. It was, as my dear Arthur would call it, rounding error money. Chloe was ecstatic. She hugged me tightly, a brief, brittle embrace, before she was already back on her phone, tapping away furiously, no doubt telling her world about her successful funding round. She gathered her things, her mind already miles away, buzzing with plans and projections. As she stood at the door, ready to leave, I said, "Be careful with it, sweetheart. That's everything I have." She paused and turned, and the mask of the grateful daughter fell away. In its place was something cold, something I had seen glimpses of before, but had never wanted to fully acknowledge. A dismissive, pitying superiority. "Mom," she said, her voice flat and devoid of warmth, You need to learn to be independent. And there it was. The sentence. The one that vaporized the past and clarified the future. She wasn't just taking my money. She was casting me adrift, lecturing the very woman whose hidden wealth was the silent, unseen ocean she'd been floating on her entire life. It wasn't about building a future for us. It was about her and her alone. The $50,000 wasn't an investment in her business. It was the price of my final lesson. She left without another word, the click of the closing door echoing in the sudden silence of the house. I stood there for a long moment, the scent of her perfume still hanging in the air. I didn't feel heartbroken. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. The fog of hope had finally burned off. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up my phone, and scrolled to a number saved under a simple, unassuming name, Arthur. He answered on the first ring, his voice as calm and steady as it had been for the last 30 years. Arthur, I said, my own voice perfectly even. It's Eleanor. Eleanor, he replied. How did it go? I looked at the empty coffee cup on the table, a faint lipstick stain from my daughter still on the rim. The test, I said, has begun. Independence. It's a powerful word. My daughter had thrown it at me like a weapon, a final dismissive judgment on a life she knew nothing about. She had no idea that for the last 30 years, I had been the very definition of the word. Not just financially, but intellectually, emotionally. My late husband Robert and I had built our world on that principle. We trusted our own research, our own instincts, and most of all, each other. After he was gone, I continued that legacy not just for myself, but for the daughter I hoped would one day understand its value. Her parting shot proved she never would. Not without a practical lesson anyway. The first move had to be subtle. Not a cannonball, but a stone skipped across the water designed to create ripples she couldn't trace back to their source. Not yet. I spent the day after our little transaction in my garden, pruning the roses, feeling the familiar texture of the leaves and the sharp prick of the thorns. It was grounding. As I worked, I thought about Chloe's business plan, the one she had so proudly swiped through on her tablet. I had committed it to memory, of course. The suppliers, the logistics chain, the marketing partners, it was all there. An intricate house of cards built on my $50,000 and a mountain of her own desperate ambition. And every house of cards has a weak point. Hers was a company called Artisan Weavers Collective, a small exclusive supplier of hand-loomed textiles from Peru. They were central to her brand's image of ethical, bespoke luxury. According to her own projections, they supplied nearly 60% of her inventory for the upcoming season. Losing them wouldn't be an inconvenience. It would be a catastrophe. After lunch, I went to my study. It's a room Chloe rarely entered, filled with old books and what she called clutter. What she saw as clutter, however, was a meticulously organized life's work. On my desk, I opened my laptop and initiated a secure video call. Arthur's face appeared crisp and professional, with the backdrop of his high-rise office in Chicago. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He knew this wasn't a social call. I told him the name of the supplier. He listened, his face impassive, and typed something into his keyboard. A few moments passed. They're a subsidiary of an import-export firm we have a minority non-voting stake in through the Andean Growth Fund, he said. Acquired 3 years ago. It's a small position, Eleanor. We have no direct influence. Minority stakes can be leveraged, Arthur, I replied calmly. Check the fund's charter. See who the other primary investors are. See which of them owes you a favor. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. He understood immediately. This wasn't about brute force. It was about influence, about the quiet, unseen web of relationships that truly governs the world of high finance. It took him less than an hour to call back. He had found his leverage point. A majority stakeholder in the fund was eager to get Arthur's support for a different, much larger venture. Pulling a single supplier contract for one of their minor subsidiaries was a small price to pay for future goodwill. The request was made not as a demand, but as a quiet, professional courtesy. No direct orders, no paper trail leading back to us. Just a simple business decision made by the supplier's parent company. The tremor hit Chloe's world 2 days later. The phone call came just as I knew it would. I was in the living room reading a history of the Dutch East India Company and sipping a cup of Earl Grey tea when my phone buzzed. It was Chloe. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, it buzzed again. And again. The sheer panic was palpable even through the silence. Finally, a string of frantic text messages began to pour in. Each was more hysterical than the last. Artisan weavers had terminated their contract, effective immediately. No explanation given, just a terse email citing a strategic realignment based on a shareholder directive. She was losing her mind. She couldn't understand how it was possible. Who were these shareholders? How could they even know about her little company? She accused her competitors. She ranted about corporate espionage. She was spiraling, trying to find a villain anywhere but in the mirror. It never once occurred to her to look in my direction. How could it? I was just Mom, the technologically inept widow who needed to learn to be independent. The thought was so absurd it would never cross her frantic mind. I watched the texts roll in a storm of confused fury and exclamation points, and I felt a profound sense of calm. The first stone had hit its mark. The ripples were spreading. I took another sip of my tea. It was perfectly steeped. Later that evening, my personal line rang. It was Arthur. "The weaver has been unraveled, Eleanor," he said, his voice dry as ever. The ripple was more of a splash than anticipated. "Their CEO is apparently in a panic fielding calls from your daughter. He has no answers for her, of course." "Excellent," I said simply. There was a pause on the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant mind, calculating the next set of variables, the next dozen possible moves on the board. "She's been tested and found wanting," he stated. It wasn't a question. "She has," I confirmed. "So," he said, his voice dropping slightly, taking on the tone of a strategist consulting his general. "What's next, Eleanor?" I looked out the window into the encroaching twilight. The game had just begun. "Next, Arthur," I said, a blueprint of beautiful, cold, and calculated chaos forming in my mind. "We let her think she can fix this. We let her scramble. And then we show her what a real shareholder directive looks like." The ensuing week was a masterclass in watching a cornered animal try to outsmart a trap it doesn't even know exists. Chloe, bless her heart, was a whirlwind of frantic, misdirected energy. She called me at least a dozen times. In the first few calls, her voice was tight with panic. By the middle of the week, it had shifted to a tone of brittle, forced confidence. She had decided on a narrative and was sticking to it with the tenacity of a bulldog. According to her, the supplier issue was a classic case of corporate sabotage. A jealous larger competitor, she claimed, had somehow strong-armed the artisan weavers collective into dropping her. It was a sign, she declared, that her brand was already a major threat. She was framing it as a badge of honor, a battle scar from the front lines of commerce. It was impressive in a delusional sort of way. She came over for dinner that Friday, an event she initiated, which was telling in itself. She needed an audience. She needed to reassure herself by reassuring me, the simple old woman whose entire life savings were supposedly tied up in this venture. She sat at my kitchen table, picking at the roast chicken I'd made, and explained it all to me in slow, simple terms, as if I were a particularly dense toddler. She told me not to worry my little head about it, that these things happen in the big leagues. She patted my hand, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt like being petted by a zookeeper. She said she had it all under control, that she was already in talks with new suppliers, even better ones. She was a fighter. She reminded me a survivor. She would pivot and adapt. She used a lot of words like that, words she'd learned from podcasts and business gurus. All the while, she never asked a single question about how I was feeling. The potential loss of my life savings was merely the inconvenient backdrop to her grand drama. I just nodded and smiled, murmuring things about how proud I was of her resilience. I played my part to perfection, the worried but supportive mother reassured by her brilliant, capable daughter. Inside, I was marveling at the sheer, breathtaking depth of her underestimation. She looked at me and saw a relic. A quiet, unassuming woman pottering around her garden, utterly disconnected from the world of power and influence she so desperately craved. The idea that I could be a player in that world, let alone a kingmaker, was so far beyond her imagination that it simply didn't exist as a possibility. And that was my greatest asset. While Chloe was busy fighting shadows and building a narrative of her own victimhood, I was engaged in a very different kind of work. My mornings were spent in my study, not in a panic, but in a state of deep, focused calm. The video calls with Arthur were precise and efficient. We weren't scrambling. We were building. Building a fortress of legal and financial strategy so solid that when the time came, there would be no loopholes, no counterclaims, no escape. Her entire corporate structure is a mess, Eleanor, Arthur said during one of our calls, scrolling through documents on his screen. She's registered as a sole proprietorship, but has taken on funding that suggests a partnership. Her tax filings are creative. It's the work of an amateur who thinks ambition is a substitute for diligence. Which makes her vulnerable, I stated. Extremely, he confirmed. But we won't attack her on a dozen flimsy fronts. We will use one single, unimpeachable point of leverage, the majority share. He explained that while my initial $50,000 was a direct infusion, his firm on my instruction had also bought out two of her other early small-time investors through a shell corporation. They were happy to cash out. Chloe in her haste had signed the paperwork without reading the fine print. She likely had no idea who the new majority owner of her debt and equity actually was. We were, for all intents and purposes, her silent, invisible senior partner. Arthur was now working with a team of corporate lawyers to draft the documents for the final move. He called it Operation Liquidation. The goal was to ensure that when we acted, it was not only legal, but textbook. Every I would be dotted, every T crossed. We would be following the letter of corporate law so precisely that any legal challenge she might attempt would be dismissed before it even reached a courtroom. He advised me on the exact steps, the formal notification, the grounds for calling an emergency shareholder meeting, the voting process, the dissolution itself. It was an ironclad framework for a controlled demolition. The key, Arthur explained, his expression serious, is the public nature of the final move. It must be done in a way that is transparent and professionally executed. It's not about revenge, Eleanor. It's about asset management. We are simply protecting our investment from a volatile and irresponsible CEO. I appreciated his framing of it. He understood that this wasn't about passion or anger for me. It was colder than that. It was about balance. It was about consequences. My daughter believed the world was a chaotic, unfair place where you had to fight and claw for everything. I was about to teach her that the world is in fact a place of perfect and terrifying order. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. She had pushed, and the universe in the form of her quiet gardening mother was about to push back. When I hung up with Arthur, I felt a stillness settle over me. Chloe was out there fighting a phantom war. And here in my quiet study, I was polishing the single perfect weapon that would end it. She thought she was on the verge of a great victory against her imagined enemies. In reality, she was just a character in a story she didn't know I was writing. And I was about to write the climax. A cornered person has two choices: surrender or double down on their delusion. My daughter, a stranger to surrender, chose the latter. Her bravado after the supplier incident lasted less than a week. The new, even better suppliers she'd boasted about never materialized. It was remarkable how a few quiet phone calls from Arthur's network to certain credit agencies and industry underwriters could paint a picture of a company suddenly deemed too risky to engage with. Doors that were once open were now politely but firmly closed. Her frantic energy curdled into raw, undisguised desperation. The community whispers started around the same time. It began on local business forums and whispered through the city's social circles. Little questions at first. I saw one online thread from a former customer asking why her order hadn't shipped. Another mentioned that Chloe's typically prolific social media presence had gone quiet. These were the first cracks appearing in the facade of her success, small fissures that threatened to splinter into chasms. Her brand was built on an image of unstoppable momentum, and for the first time, she was visibly stalled. She was losing control of the narrative, and it was terrifying for her. I knew what her last resort would be. When you can't get supplies and you can't get credit, you turn to the one thing you think you can control: debt, a bank loan. It was the last move of a player who believes they can borrow their way out of a hole they dug themselves. She would walk into a bank armed with her doctored projections and manufactured confidence and try to sell them the same dream she had sold me. Arthur had already prepared for this. We had a short list of the 3 banks she was most likely to approach based on her previous business dealings. We made sure the necessary paperwork was filed, not with all of them, but with the one we knew had the most stringent due diligence process. The trap wasn't just set, it was baited and waiting. The day she went to the bank, I spent the morning at the city's botanical garden. I walked through the orchid house marveling at the strange, beautiful complexity of the flowers. Each one was a testament to patience, to slow, deliberate growth. There was no faking it, no rushing the process. Nature has its own laws, its own timeline. It was a lesson my daughter had always tried to cheat. I imagined the scene vividly. Chloe dressed in her most severe and professional attire, her power suit. She would sit across a wide, polished desk from a loan officer, a man I pictured as being in his late 50s, tired and immune to charm. He would have seen thousands of ambitious young people just like her, full of buzzwords and empty confidence. She would have made her pitch flawlessly, I'm sure. She would have explained away the supplier issue as a temporary setback, a strategic pivot. She would have presented her financials a document of such creative accounting that it bordered on fiction. And the loan officer would have listened patiently, nodding his face, giving nothing away. Then he would have taken her documents and said he needed a few minutes to run them by the underwriting department. I could picture her sitting there, the confidence beginning to fray at the edges, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. The wait would have felt like an eternity. When the loan officer returned, his demeanor would have shifted from professional neutrality to something cool and distant. This was the part I had rehearsed in my mind, the dialogue Arthur and I had scripted with the precision of a legal document. It was the moment the ground would give way beneath her feet. He wouldn't have accused her of anything. He would simply have stated a fact, a matter of internal policy. He would have explained that the bank had a fiduciary duty to its shareholders. And in the course of their due diligence, a significant red flag had been raised. A public filing, in fact. "I'm sorry, Ms. Vance," he would have said, sliding her documents back across the desk. "We won't be able to extend a line of credit to your company at this time." She would have been stunned, ready to argue. But before she could speak, he would have delivered the killing blow, the sentence designed to shatter her reality. "Bank policy, Huss," He would continue, his voice flat and final, prevents us from lending to any entity where the majority shareholder has already filed a notice of intent to liquidate assets. It's simply too high risk. I can see her face in my mind's eye, the confusion, the disbelief. Majority shareholder intent to liquidate. What was he talking about? She was the owner. She was the one in charge. I think there's been a mistake. She would have stammered, her voice a pitch higher than usual. I am the majority shareholder. I own the company. The loan officer would have sighed a weary exhalation and tapped his computer screen. According to the corporate registry, the majority stake in your company, a controlling interest of 65%, is held by a firm called E. Vance Wealth Holdings. They filed the notice this morning. As of 9:07 a.m., your company is slated for dissolution. E. Vance. Eleanor Vance. That was the earthquake. The moment her entire world, everything she thought she knew, was turned inside out. The name would have just hung there in the air between them. A name she knew better than her own. The name of the simple, quiet, naive mother she had dismissed and patronized her entire life. It was impossible. It couldn't be, and yet it was. The fallout was immediate. My phone rang less than 10 minutes after she would have stormed out of the bank. I was home by then, watering my orchids. I let it ring. Then came the text. A single, frantic line of garbled letters and question marks. I ignored it. Finally, she called again. This time I answered, putting the phone on speaker as I misted a phalaenopsis. Her voice was unrecognizable, a raw shriek of panic and disbelief. She wasn't speaking. She was firing accusations, questions, and threats in a chaotic, breathless torrent. She spoke of the bank, of a holding company, of my name. She demanded to know what was going on, what sick game I was playing. I let her exhaust herself. When she finally paused, gasping for air, I spoke, my voice as calm and gentle as the mist settling on the orchid's leaves. Chloe, dear, I said softly, whatever are you talking about? You told me not to worry my little head about business. Remember. There was a choked sound on the other end of the line, a strangled gasp as the first shockwave of the earthquake hit her. The world she knew was gone. She was standing in the rubble, and for the first time she was looking up and seeing me. Really seeing me. And I knew in that moment of dawning horror she was beginning to understand that the earthquake was just the beginning. The tsunami was still on its way. There is a specific kind of power that comes from being underestimated your entire life. It's a quiet, patient power, a hidden reserve you build year after year, brick by brick, in the silent spaces where people have dismissed you. My daughter saw me as a quaint, harmless relic. That was her foundational mistake. Today, I was going to demolish the entire building. The 48 hours after the phone call were a blur of frantic, unanswered messages from Chloe. They ranged from tearful pleading to furious, incoherent threats. It was the digital death rattle of a person who has lost all control and cannot comprehend it. I read none of them. They were irrelevant. The plan was already in motion, a complex piece of machinery set in motion by her own hand, and its gears were turning with relentless mechanical precision. The morning of the emergency shareholder meeting, I did not dress as Mom. I went to the back of my walk-in closet, a space Chloe had only ever glanced into, and retrieved a garment bag I hadn't opened in years. Inside was a charcoal gray power suit, custom-tailored in London, the kind of clothing that acts as armor. It felt familiar, comfortable. A relic from a past life Chloe knew nothing about, a life where I sat in boardrooms, not kitchens. My hair was styled not in its usual soft bun, but in a severe, elegant chignon. When I looked in the mirror, I did not see Eleanor Vance, the quiet widow. I saw E. Vance, the strategist. Arthur was waiting for me in my study. He too was dressed for battle, his suit impeccable, He had transformed my study into a command center. A large monitor dominated my desk, and a series of smaller tablets were arranged beside it, each displaying different streams of data. It was time. Arthur made a final check of the secure video link, gave me a single affirmative nod, and the meeting began. A grid of faces appeared on the screen. Most were lawyers and accountants from Arthur's firm, the official representatives for the various shell corporations we controlled. They were the silent professional chorus to my lead role. And then there was one other window. Chloe. She looked like a ghost. Her usually perfect hair was a mess. Her face was pale and blotchy, and she was wearing a stained sweatshirt. She was in what I recognized as her home office, the carefully curated backdrop for her old video calls. But now it looked like a disaster zone with papers strewn about. When her eyes found mine, they widened with a fresh wave of disbelief and a raw animal terror. The sight of me, composed and armored in my suit, was so alien to her that she visibly flinched. I began without preamble, my voice crisp and even devoid of any emotion. I read from the official notice calling the emergency meeting of the shareholders of Vance Innovations, LLC, to order. I stated the purpose of the meeting to discuss the immediate and significant financial instability of the company and to vote on a motion for its immediate dissolution to protect shareholder assets. Chloe found her voice then. It was a ragged, desperate sound. She started talking about a mistake, a misunderstanding. She accused me of being senile, of being manipulated by Arthur. She pleaded with the other faces on the screen, not realizing they all worked for me. It was a pathetic, chaotic defense, and I let her go on for precisely 60 seconds before I cut her off. "Your objections are noted," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic monologue like glass. "We will now proceed to the statement from the majority shareholder." I picked up the prepared document. This was not a mother scolding her child. This was a CEO delivering a verdict. I spoke of fiscal irresponsibility, of unsustainable burn rates, of a failure to secure a viable market position. I used the cold, impersonal language of a corporate autopsy. I outlined how the company's leadership, her leadership, had failed to meet its fiduciary duties. With every word, I could see the fight draining out of her, replaced by a hollow, sickening understanding. The $50,000 wasn't mentioned. It was a private insult, but this was a public execution. Therefore, I concluded, looking directly into the camera, directly at her, Evance Wealth Holdings, as the majority shareholder, finds that the current leadership has proven itself incapable of managing the assets entrusted to it. To prevent further losses and mitigate the damage of a poorly managed investment, I am tabling a motion for the immediate and complete liquidation of all company assets. Arthur, in the window next to mine, spoke for the first time. "The motion has been tabled. We will now vote. All in favor?" I raised my hand. "Aye," I said, my voice clear and steady. One by one, the other windows lit up with raised hands and muted ayes. It was unanimous. Chloe just stared, her mouth slightly open, a silent scream trapped in her throat. "The motion carries," Arthur announced formally. "The dissolution will begin immediately. Receivers have been dispatched to the company's registered office." And then, the master stroke. The final, brutal lesson in cause and effect. A new window opened on the screen. It wasn't a face. It was a live video feed, grainy and shaky from a smartphone. I recognized the reception area of Chloe's office, the one she had been so proud of. The video panned around, and then the front doors opened. Two men in suits holding clipboards walked in, the receivers. We all watched in silence as they began their work. They spoke to the stunned-looking receptionist, handed her a document, and then proceeded to walk through the office, placing stickers on computers, on desks, on boxes of inventory. This wasn't a story. It wasn't a threat. It was happening. Right now, Chloe was forced to watch her entire professional world, the source of her arrogance and her identity, be dismantled and tagged for sale piece by humiliating piece. As this silent, horrifying drama played out, Arthur's tablet pinged. He glanced down, then looked at me and gave a subtle nod. The press release had just hit the wire. On another tablet, I saw the first headlines begin to pop up on financial news websites. Local tech darling Vance Innovations implodes amidst shareholder revolt. Startup liquidated after burning through investor capital. The story was out. The public humiliation was now complete and spreading like wildfire. That's when Chloe finally broke. It wasn't a scream of anger anymore. It was a raw, primal wail of loss. She was begging now, not to me, but to the screen, to anyone. She promised to change to pay it all back. She cried about her reputation, about what people would think. It was all about her. Even in her complete and utter ruin, it was all about her. I watched her collapse, my face impassive. This was the reckoning. The cold, hard consequence she had never had to face before. The role reversal was absolute. The powerful, condescending daughter was now a pleading child. The quiet, simple mother was now the arbiter of her fate. I let her cry for a few moments, letting the full weight of it crush her. Then I leaned forward. "The meeting is adjourned," I said, and with a click of the mouse, I closed her window, plunging her into silence. The screen went black. The reckoning was complete. Justice, in its own cold, impartial way, had been served. The silence that followed the storm was the most profound I have ever known. It wasn't an empty silence. It was full, a rich, textured quiet that settled over my life like a blanket of fresh snow. In the first few days, my old phone, which I had left on the kitchen counter of my old house, became a monument to Chloe's grief cycle. It buzzed and pinged through the 5 stages denial in the form of frantic demands to stop this joke, anger in a stream of vicious capitalized insults, bargaining with tearful promises to change, depression in long, rambling voicemails full of self-pity, and finally, a bitter, resentful acceptance that blamed me for everything. I listened to none of them. They were the echoes of a life I no longer lived, the sound of a door closing and locking behind me. On the 3rd day, I instructed Arthur to have the number disconnected. It was a simple administrative task, but it felt like a final, necessary surgery. The cord was cut. She had told me to be independent. Now she would have her own chance to learn the meaning of the word. My new life began with the sea. I had bought a house on the coast of Oregon, a place of rugged, beautiful shorelines and the constant, soothing roar of the Pacific. It wasn't a mansion, but a modern house of glass and cedar that felt like a part of the landscape. It was a house for Eleanor, not for Mom. A house with a library filled with my books, a proper study for my work, and a deck that overlooked the endless ocean. Here the air was clean and sharp, and for the first time in years I felt I could breathe all the way down to the bottom of my lungs. I spent my afternoons on the beach, wrapped in a cashmere blanket against the cool breeze, reading not financial reports, but novels, history, poetry. My phone, a new one, with a new number known only to a select few, was always turned off during these hours. I had spent a lifetime being quietly connected, monitoring planning. Now my greatest luxury was the freedom of being unreachable, the freedom from the obligation to be anything to anyone but myself. One afternoon, out of a detached sense of anthropological curiosity, I took my tablet and navigated to Chloe's social media page, or where it used to be. The profile was now private, locked down tight. Her brand, once a beacon of curated perfection, was now a digital fortress. But the internet never truly forgets. A few searches brought up screenshots and cached posts from the day of the reckoning. The public comments on articles about her company's collapse were a brutal testament to the transactional nature of her world. Former friends and collaborators were publicly distancing themselves, expressing their shock and disappointment. Influencers who had once praised her vision were now posting vague statements about the importance of integrity. Her social capital had been liquidated as swiftly and completely as her company's assets. She had built her world on a foundation of shifting sand, and the tide had come in. I felt a flicker of something not pity, but a kind of academic sadness for her. Then I closed the tablet and turned back to the ocean. Her world was no longer my concern. A week into my new life, Arthur flew out to visit. He arrived not with the grim formality of our planning sessions, but with the relaxed air of an old friend. We sat on the deck, sipping a rare single malt scotch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He handed me a slim, leather-bound folder. "The final report on the reallocation," he said. I opened it. It was all there in black and white. The assets of Vance Innovations LLC had been sold off. The debts were settled. The remaining funds, including my initial $50,000, had been absorbed back into my main portfolio. The numbers were clean, efficient, and final. On the last page was a summary of my portfolio's performance for the quarter. Arthur pointed to a line item. After accounting for all expenses, the net effect of the dissolution and reallocation of those assets has resulted in a 5% quarterly growth in your primary technology fund, he said. It turns out dismantling my daughter's dream was a sound financial move. It wasn't just about justice. It was about good business. A slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of triumph or glee. It was a smile of deep, quiet satisfaction. The satisfaction of a complex equation solved of a chaotic system brought back into balance. It was the smile of a woman who had been told to be independent by someone who had no idea what the word truly meant. Here in my house by my ocean with my own fortune, secured not by chance, but by my own mind, I was the very definition of it. I had passed my own test. Arthur raised his glass. "To new realities," he said. I clinked my glass against his, the sound a small, clear note against the timeless roar of the waves. "To new realities," I echoed, feeling the warmth of the scotch and the cool sea air on my skin. I was finally, completely, and unapologetically free. Eleanor learned that telling someone to be independent can have the most unforeseen consequences. Her daughter Chloe thought it was a dismissal, a final cutting of the cord. What she didn't realize was that her mother was about to give her a $50,000 masterclass on the subject. Through a series of cold, calculated moves, Eleanor taught her that true independence isn't built by taking from others. It is forged in the fires of accountability and earned through one's own strength and wisdom. It was a painful lesson in consequences, but that is what real justice looks like.